All right, I'm now live. Woo, whoopee. So excited.
Where your food at?
Got some in the dishwasher. And yeah, probably just grab one out the dishwasher.
Dishwasher. Charlie, see you fancy, man.
Is that in the dishwasher?
You are a fancy man. Watch my figure, man.
What's up, Mr. John?
Doing well. How are you on this Tuesday?
It's another day, man. You know, same thing I do every day. So, Mr. Josh, you coming back to Hart next year, or you? What's it looking like?
So the deadline for them to respond back to AmeriCorps members is week, but it increasingly looks like I will be off to somewhere else.
Wow. Apparently, I'll be teaching this next year. So
I heard. I was yesterday. Very exciting.
I guess maybe I don't know. Let's see. What up, y'all? What's going on? Mr. Josh, I think we're gonna start with day 2. Supporting question on day 2, page 7. Uh, source B, Declaration of Sentiments. I think that's where we left off.
Yep.
All right. I tell you what, I'll read the background, and you want to read the paragraphs, and we'll chunk it.
Sure.
All right. Sounds good. Background. Throughout this school year, you've learned about how early American society was highly influenced by the institution of slavery and the exclusion of rights for many. The following sources present historical artifacts and analysis that address the question, who desired change? As an important final note, the topic of slavery may bring up many types of emotional responses. It is important to talk through our emotions with people we trust, such as members of our families, our teachers, and our friends. That was perfect. All right. Source B, Declaration of Sentiments. We're on page 7, guys, if you're following along. Josh, take it away.
So, as we were talking about last week, in this time in the 1840s and the 1850s, women did not have a lot of rights. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to hold office. A lot of them couldn't work jobs outside of their houses, and their husbands or their families were very controlling of what they could do or what they wanted to do. So with slavery, a lot of women started to push back against oppression of women as well. And we're going to read a document from them.
Right. A reminder that the same people who were abolitionists also, when it came to the female side, were also women's suffragists. So you had a lot of overlap between the women's suffrage movement and the abolitionist movement during this time. Just a reminder.
We're on page 6, the newest packet that you should have gotten.
Oh, I thought it was page 7.
Um,
Declaration of Sentiments. I got page 7.
I got you. So,
7, guys. Sorry, mine might be formatted funky. Sorry, guys. Thank you, Mr. Josh.
Declaration of Sentiments. In 1848, an assembly of women who had been excluded, who had been left out from the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London 8 years earlier, gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, the home of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, modeling her declaration closely on the Declaration of Independence. So we're going to hear a lot of language in this that's close to the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it, and to insist upon the institution of a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Question, Mr. Josh. And I'll pose this question to the group as well, so just drop it in the chat, guys. The original Constitution stated, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal." Did that not include women? I want you guys to post that in the chat. What do you think they meant when the founding fathers made that statement in the Declaration of Independence? We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. Did that not include women? Did that not include, wasn't it originally meant to include everybody? Weren't they referring to mankind when they said men? I got one person saying no. Interesting. Looking for some more explanations. When they say all men, aren't they referring to all of mankind? Or maybe they're just referring to men in general. Maybe they're just referring to all males are created equal. What do you think, Mr. Josh? What do you think they meant?
So we have to go back and we have to remember in this time period, who had power? Who was writing these things? So people are dropping in that they were referring to only men. And that's right, because if we remember, women didn't have much power. They didn't have much authority in this time. But it's not all men. We have to remember which group of men. Someone said it, white men. Exactly. White men were the ones writing these documents, these papers. White men were the ones controlling the economy. They were the ones setting up the government. And they were the ones continuing slavery. So when they said all men are created equal, they were referring to mostly just white men or someone who had enough money to play.
Correct. Originally, landowning white men, not even just white men. You had to own land. You had to have wealth. Now, there's another piece in here. If you go to line 3, deriving their just powers, meaning the people derive, meaning they receive their, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, meaning the government gets its powers from the people, right? And how do people exercise their rights over the government? You guys drop it in the chat. We've talked about this before, so this is a review. The government deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. I derive my powers from the consent of the governed, the permission of the governed. How do we exercise our power over the government? Drop it in there. This is important for you guys to remember, not just from my course, but as you're going through history when we're talking about democracy and when you're participating in democracy later on in your life and voting and all that good stuff. How do we exercise our power over the government? Waiting on this lag. How do we exercise power over the government? There's something we do. Huh. Come on. Seriously? Voting. We live in a democracy. We vote for representatives. We vote for people to run our government for us, right? We live in a representative democracy, meaning we vote for representatives to represent us and our interests. So the government gets its power from the people, right? We put the people in power who run the government, in theory at least.
So a big part of that, a big part of having the belief that by being a part of that country, by being an American citizen, that women should have the ability to vote, to make those decisions. A lot of what these women were pushing for was saying, on one hand, slavery is preventing people from voting. It's preventing people from exercising those rights to change the government. But they're also going to turn it and say, well, we're fighting for the rights of people who are enslaved, what about fighting for our own rights? We can't vote either. We don't have a say. We can't do many things. So a lot of people that were in the anti-slavery movement also moved to the women's rights movement, or the suffragette movement, as it would be called, because they saw that both groups didn't have rights and they wanted to work to give them rights.
Correct. All right. Let's move on to paragraph 2 here. Well, paragraph 3 technically. Government long established.
And exactly. So someone's saying that they are protesting, and that's exactly what they did. There are some very interesting videos in black and white of women in protest groups in the early 1900s. And this is still at a time where women are not expected to be outside the house. So these courageous women, these brave women, doing things like that is really important, because it shows that they are ready and willing to do what it takes to get their rights. So we're on the next paragraph. Governments long established should not be changed for light causes, and accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer. While evils are sufferable, then to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is in their duty to throw off such government. So let's take a time out, because that is very dense language. So let's go through that. Let's go through that line by line and see what we're trying to figure out. First line is, governments long established should not be changed for light causes.
So what I take from that, Mr. Josh, is that once a government has been instituted for a period of time, you don't just go changing it without a reasonable cause. It needs to be a great cause in order to change it, right? You don't just change things lightly. You don't change things often. And it needs to be a major change when you do make those changes.
Exactly. And someone's saying, didn't slavery and women come together to protest? Exactly.
That's what we meant when we said abolitionists. Abolitionists were those who worked to free slaves. Suffragists were those who worked for the voting rights of women. And those groups overlapped. Several of those members were both at the Seneca Falls Convention.
And one could say, and I would say as well, that slavery and women's rights are not light causes. They are very, very important things. And by stepping up and saying these are important things that we are fighting for, we are taking that step to go against our government, to go in a way of protest or in a way of opposition. So we're going to move on to the next line. All experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, and while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. So when I read this sentence, and this is written in a very old way of writing, I see that they talk about evils and that the evils are sufferable or bad. But those bad evils that we deal with, we have to look at them and compare them to the forms. So we always have to remember, if we're working towards achieving something or working towards fixing something, we have to remember that in that process, as we do that, we can't make things worse. We can't make choices that are worse than the thing that we were trying to fix. So when we're working towards ending slavery, when we're working towards giving women's rights, or in the modern day, the Black Lives Matter movement or other protest groups, we have to make sure that our solutions don't make things worse for everybody.
I concur.
So the next line: when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under despotism, it is their duty to throw off such government.
So to me, what I say from that, Mr. Johnson, when there's a long history of abuse of a certain group or uh, a certain aspect of society, you have these long history of abuses over periods of time, over years, over all these different incidents. There's a certain point where the people have to rise up and overthrow that government.
Yeah. When something has gone on long enough, when the people cannot take it anymore after years and years and years, it is their right, it is their job almost to step up and say, this is not how things should be. We're going to change things for the better. And then we'll go on to the last sentence. The history of mankind is a history of injuries on the part of man towards women, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So
So essentially, over the long term, the history of mankind, all throughout the time that man has existed, men have abused women, is what she's saying. Men have abused women and been abusive towards women, making them, like they say here, the direct establishment of tyranny. So whether it be physical tyranny, tyranny by law, women remain under the boot of men, according to her stance here. And to prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. She's about to go through all the different ways in which women have experienced abuse from men in the past and continue to experience that abuse from men.
yeah, so this is actually something that Ms. Radden talks about a lot with supporting evidence and structuring your arguments in the way that you write your essays. Because if Elizabeth Cady Stanton just went up and said, oh, I feel like men are keeping me oppressed, they're pushing me down, and then did nothing to support that, I don't know if that's a true argument or not. I can't figure out if that works. But she's about to show all of this evidence, all of this support of ways that they are pushing women down and that they are preventing them from being free. And it's going to show people that she is right and that they need to fight back against that.
Right. And I saw some people dropping some things in the chat. So, yeah, women at a certain point in our history cannot own land. So they had to be married in order to inherit their family's land, in order to own land and have possessions. There's a period where women were looked at as possessions simply for the reproductive purpose. So they didn't have a voice in politics. They weren't allowed to work. Their place was in the home. You had these different types of things that were going on, these different dynamics that weren't always necessarily written into law, but were established and understood as norms during that period of time. So let's continue.
So he, as in men, he has never permitted her to exercise her right to the elective franchise, to vote. He has compelled her to submit to laws in the formation of which she had no voice.
Now
He,
pause. The formation of which she has no voice, essentially saying that women had no say in these laws of the land. So they're having to follow laws that they had no say in, right? Just like black people living in a country where they had no say in the laws that were created here, right? So that's a very important piece. When you're living under laws that you were not able to construct and don't give you a voice, the result of that law typically does not work in your favor.
exactly. Someone saying women had no right to speak, that's exactly what it was. If someone passes a law that hurts me, but I can't vote for my representative, for my senator to fight against it, I have no control. I have no ability to change what's going on. And we see something like this actually in the 1960s. We went in a war against a country called Vietnam in Asia, and there were there was what is called the draft, which means that men aged 18 to, I believe, 25 are required to sign up to go into the military. And there was a lot about it, but that was basically the idea. And people were bringing up the point that 18-year-olds couldn't vote. You had to be 21 to vote. So there were adults, legal adults, that were being told, you have no say in this, you have no vote, but you still have to go. So as a part of this, with the civil rights movement, you see the age that people can vote at go down from 21 to 18. Because the idea was, if you could be old enough to join the military, you should be old enough to vote. So it's the same idea of being able to form the laws, to have a say, to exercise that voice, and make sure that things can change if they impact you.
Correct. And somebody, I think, had a question about the draft. Yeah, the draft was literally, if you were a male, you could be drafted into the military because they needed enough people to fight in the military. And you could not resist. If you resisted, you would go to prison. Some of you guys may know about Muhammad Ali, who was drafted and refused to go. And as a result, he was locked up for a period of time. You might also have heard that our president was, I believe, drafted at one point or supposed to be doing some military service. But unfortunately, guys, he has bone spurs, so he was not able to join and enlist and be all he could be in the army.
Yeah.
That was when you have a certain amount of money, you can get out of things. So
my dad actually was part of the draft, but the war ended before he could be deployed in the army. So it really did impact a lot of people. There are many other countries in the world that have a draft. Someone said North Korea. That's exactly right. They have a very large army, and they require that men join that army for a certain amount of years. South Korea also has a draft. Israel, a lot of other countries around the world has as a part of their culture, as a part of their society. But it still requires that those people have the ability to vote, that they have the ability to, and they are viewed as equals.
And just so you guys know, America has not used the draft, but it's still available. So when you turn 18, for instance, when I was applying to college, I had to fill out a form that said I was eligible to be drafted and basically register, so that if anything ever happened and America felt like it needed to use a draft, you would be registered for the draft. So it's unlikely that we'll have another draft anytime soon, but it is still a concept that has not been done away with in American society. I just want you guys to be aware of that as well. But you'll learn about drafts and wars later on in another history class. All right, where we at?
He has compelled her to submit to laws in which formation of which she has no voice. He has withheld from her rights which are given to the most ignorant and degraded men, both natives and foreigners. He has made her, if married, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. He has taken for her all right and property, even to the wages that she earns. In marriage, she is compelled to promise obedience to her husband, and he believes he becomes, to all intents and purposes, her master. The law giving him power to deprive her of liberty and to administer chastisement. And this is very, very important, because the language that Elizabeth Cady Stanton is using, she's saying things like master, deprive her of liberty, obedience. What type of life or what institution that we've been talking about does this sound like? What does it remind you of in what we've been learning about in the past few weeks?
Mm-hmm. And let's just talk about what that looks like for a second while you guys are thinking about that. When it says, to all intents and purposes, her master, with the big hint there that you gave, Mr. Josh, the law giving him power to deprive her of her liberty and to administer chastisement. So what did that look like? Chastisement. That meant that if my wife disobeyed me, I could beat her, or I could spank her, or I could administer any type of punishment I saw fit. This was a reality back then. Domestic abuse was not a thing. You couldn't call the police and say, "Hey, my husband beat me." It was the norm. Okay, so that's one piece. Giving him power to deprive her of her liberty and administer chastisement. Once again, if she had wages, if she did work, that money went to her husband. That money went to her husband. Another thing we talk about a lot is sexual abuse. There are laws that protect women who are married from sexual abuse by their partner. There are laws that prevent women. Yes, slavery. Good job. But there are laws that prevent women from being abused by their husbands. Those laws did not exist back then. There was no resistance. There was no resistance to rape, sexual abuse, or physical abuse from your husband because you were his property. And there was no law to protect you. There was no institution to protect you. And yes,
And
Momo said it. She said that this is very similar to the institution of slavery when you think about the rights of women. I'll let you go, Mr. Johnson.
yeah, and that's the main connection that she's trying to make, is that slavery is just the idea that you are depriving people of their rights, that they have no control over themselves. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton is trying to make the argument that in many ways, women who could not vote, who could not decide the laws, who could not make money or own land, in many ways they were slaves to their husbands or to their families. Now there were differences. It wasn't all the same, but she's making these connections between the lack of ability, the lack of control, and she's standing up and she wants to fight back against that for everyone. She wants to fight back against that lack of control for slaves, and she wants to fight back against it for women, so that everybody is in a better spot, so that everyone in a healthier spot, as people are saying. So let's wrap up.
Somebody asked a question: why did people participate in the institution of slavery? And we hadn't talked about this in a while. It had to do with money, free labor, right? If I own a McDonald's corporation and I have 10 employees, I have to pay all those employees, right? But if I own a McDonald's corporation and I have 10 employees and I don't have to pay them, that means I get to keep all that money that those employees generate. So remember, slavery is more so about the money and the financial piece. Everything else is a part of it, but it's peripheral, meaning it came as a consequence of the institution of slavery. But originally, it was about money. There was never a point where it was not about money. So just remember that.
Yeah, and Cady Stanton talks about in this section as well that if women made money, their husbands took it. So there's a part of this where those wages, that wealth that they create is taken away from them. So they're not getting paid for their work.
Yeah, okay, so you guys are asking some interesting questions. Somebody just asked, if women are known to be smarter than men, why are men in control of society? And I'm seeing some comments. Okay, so let's talk about something that's a little off task here. Men are the more powerful physically sex. So out of men and women, men tend to be larger, stronger, more physically powerful. Okay. Not only that, but personality-wise, biology-wise, and this is more of a scientific thing, men tend to have more aggressive and dominant personalities, and women tend to be more moderate in their personalities. Now, that's not 100%, but it's a tendency, okay? So when you talk about things that took place in history, you had a combination of two things that transpired throughout history. You had a combination of men being the more physical, more dominant, more aggressive of the two genders, and you had women being less physically strong, but also less aggressive than men. So if you look at most societies, really all societies, for the most part, you will see it being patriarchal, where the men exhibit or exert a certain amount of control. Now, what that looks like can be different in different societies and different pieces, and it doesn't at all have anything to do, or it shouldn't at all dictate whether men or women have the same rights or not. But somebody asked a question kind of historically, that's kind of part of what's taking place. So the oppression of women has come in some different forms throughout history, but it's, I think, based on those two things, or grounded in those two things.
So let's wrap this section up and see if we've got any questions on the end. After depriving her, remember her is just women in general. After depriving her of all rights as a married woman, if single, and the owner of property, he has taxed her to support a government which recognizes her only when her property can be made profitable. He has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, all colleges being closed against her. So, the end of this paragraph, we're talking about money again. The only time the government cares about these women, about women in general, if it can take their money, is if it can tax them for what land they have. And looking at education, you're all about to go to high school, or almost, we're looking at high school next year. And back in this time, most people didn't go to high school. It was less than 5-10%. So we're looking at a very small group of people being given education, and that education was men only. Women were not allowed to move past a certain grade in education because it wasn't deemed necessary. And Stanton is pushing back, and she says, well, if I'm just as smart as men, if I'm just as strong and capable, I should be able to learn too. I should be able to vote. I should be able to make money. I'm equal to you. So let's treat me like that. Let's give me those rights.
And in order for men to continue with their iron grip they have on society, there are two things that they could not do. If I'm a white male and I give the right to an education away to women or minorities, and I also allow them to have money or financial backing, then I am losing my grip on society to a certain extent. And that was what you need to really, really pay attention to. Why were women having to give over all their money? Why could they not own property? Because that would give them power, right? That would give them power. And there's no way. It's the same reason why slaves were not allowed to read, right? Knowledge being power, being able to change their station based on their education. So part of keeping this system going, where if you were a white male, particularly a white male of means, you could control your society, was by not allowing others to get the two most important things in society, which are education and money.
Yeah. So when we talk about education and people being educated or people not being educated, if I have slaves, or if I'm a woman and I'm not allowed to have much education, maybe I know a little bit of math, maybe I can read a very small amount, that gives me power. It allows me to do things. It allows me to maybe make money or be in a better position. But if I'm in a position of power, if I'm up top, like Mr. Pugh said, if I'm a white man, or if I'm a slave owner, or if I'm a husband, I want to stay up top. I don't want other people getting power that I might have to fight with or compete. So I will prevent my wife from learning much, or I will prevent slaves from learning how to read and write, because it means that I can control them easier. If they don't have power, they can't do anything. So I'm going to try to take that power away from them when I can.
And while we're on the subject, Mr. Josh, we might as well just make the correlation here if you guys weren't able to make that correlation yet. Throughout society, American society was essentially formed for white males of European descent who left Europe, right? It was about white males being able to become wealthy, being able to control their own destiny, being able to control their own country at the expense of anybody else. So since the time of slaves being freed, women gaining the right to vote, minorities gaining the right to an education, etc., the power of these white males has diminished. Now, are white men still in control of the United States? Absolutely. But think about the difference in control back in 1800 versus in 2020, right? Where you have people of color, women, and other groups who are in power. We just had a woman run for president, right? That could have never happened back then. That wasn't even a thought. So understand, we're talking about racism and prejudice that's developed over time. Each time that a group is able to move forward in our society, you have a backlash from the group that is losing some of that inherent power in society, right? So you think about having to go from you're only competing with other white men to having to compete with women, black men, Asian women, all these different groups. Now you have to compete with where it used to just be you. And you also used to only deal with individuals who had your experience of being a white male. So you were able to get those jobs more easily. You were able to have whatever conversation you wanted to have more easily. You had no check within the society because you were the society. You controlled the society, you ran it. So understand that the racism and the prejudice that you guys see now today is all part of a long history of the backlash of the group that was originally in power in the United States losing and giving ground on some of that power.
And that's the power of education, is that it gives people the ability to move up, to gain power, and to gain a better life for themselves. So if you look at the civil rights movement, a large part of the civil rights movement was access to education, the ability to go to good colleges with white students, the ability to get good jobs that they were prevented from doing so. And in the modern day, that's also a leading cause for the Black Lives Matter movement, is that access to education gives people power. Power makes people's lives better, and making people's lives better is what this is all about. So this access to education, this access to change your life, or the ability to change your life, is universal with all oppressed groups. Trying to move up and make yourself in a better spot is what people are fighting for. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton is saying the only two ways that women can do this are by getting an education and learning and being able to vote. So those are the two things that she's going to push for the hardest, so that women can be in a better position in society.
All right. All right. And did we get through that whole paragraph?
Yes.
We
And
did.
she ends that whole section. So she's talked to us about how women can't vote. Their money is being taken from them. They can't learn. They can't own property. They can't do many things. And she ends this whole thing by repeating her argument. In the view of this entire disenfranchisement of one half of the people of this country, so one half of the people can't vote, we insist that they have immediate admission to all the rights and privileges which belong to them as citizens of the United States. So she ends this by saying, we are citizens just like you. Women are the same as men. So why treat us different? Let us learn. Let us make money. Let us own property. Let us vote. Because at the end of the day, men and women are the same in the eyes of the law. So let's treat us like that. Treat us the same.
All right. So moving on, I think we have time to start this section on Nat Turner. Document C, Nat Turner. And this is on the next page. Mine says page 8. It might be a different page, guys. Mr. Josh, is it page 8 for you, or is it a different page?
It is page 7 for me. And for
Okay.
the people in the chat, what they're saying is that for the population, about 50% or half is male and 50% is female. So if you have a country where 1 out of 2 people, half of people can't vote, that is a serious concern to that country's democracy, just because they're a woman. So she's arguing, well, if we are half the country and we are citizens, we should be able to vote too. It's our right, it's our duty. And you should be able to let us do that so that we can change things too.
Yeah, and just to highlight that fact too, right? So, white males were half of the population of white society during that time. But at this time, we've got Asians coming in. We've got people migrating, some from South America. We have a large African American population in the South, right? So when you talk about the group that is able to vote, which is just white males, formerly just land-owning white males, but now just white males, they don't even represent 50% of the country at this point in reality, right? They don't even represent 50% of the country. So you have maybe, let's say 45% of the country at best at this time that is making all the decisions. So I just wanted to highlight that fact that you have a small group of individuals who maintain control over the country. And we still see that to this day. If you look at the gender of our representatives and we look at the fact that we haven't had a female president, we finally had a minority president, but not a female president. So all these things are still intact to a certain extent. Most of the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies are white men, like 80%, 85%. So these are things, guys, to think about, that within our country still, we have a small group of people who have the majority of the power. So think about that, particularly when you're thinking about your right to exercise to vote later down the line, and the things that you guys plan on doing and participating in democracy. All right, so we'll read this first paragraph with Nat Turner. We probably won't have a lot of time left, and we'll pick back up. Nathaniel Nat Turner, 1800 to 1831, was an enslaved man who led the only effective sustained slave rebellion, August 1831, in U.S. history. Spreading terror throughout the white South, his actions set off a new wave of oppressive legislation prohibiting the education, movement, and assembly of enslaved people, and stifling pro-slavery, anti-abolitionist convictions that persisted in the region until the American Civil War in 1861 to 1865. He was born on the Virginia plantation of Benjamin Turner, who allowed him to be instructed in reading, writing, and religion. Sold 3 times in his childhood and hired out to John Travis, he became a fiery preacher and leader of enslaved Africans on Benjamin Turner's plantation and in his Southampton County neighborhood, claiming that he was chosen by God to lead them from bondage. An insurrection was planned, aborted, and rescheduled for August 21st, 1831, when he and 6 others killed the Travis family, managed to secure arms and horses, and enlisted about 75 other enslaved people in a disorganized insurrection that resulted in the murder of 51 white people. Afterwards, Turner hid nearby successfully for 6 weeks until his discovery, conviction, and hanging at Jerusalem, Virginia, along with 16 of his followers. In confessions that were narrated to Southern lawyer Thomas R. Gray after his capture on October 30th, 1831, and published for his trial, Nat Turner is reported to have said, "I heard a loud noise in the heavens, and the spirit was loosened, and Christ had laid down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and that I should take it on and fight against the serpent slaveholders. For the time was fast approaching when the first should be last and the last should be first." Now, the irony of what we just read is that religion was used to control slaves. It was used to control slaves. But we saw that as this man became literate and was able to interpret the Bible for himself, religion became the opposite. It became a sounding call for him to rebel and get others to rebel with him. So what they had done backfired. And once again, the power of literacy, why they didn't want slaves to read, why they didn't want them to be able to communicate, why they didn't want them to be able to organize, why they didn't want them to even understand what they were learning on Sundays.
His education, his strength, and his ability to change his position gave him the power to help organize other slaves in the area and successfully fight back against slavery in those places. He took that information, he took that education, and made it into power. He brought himself up by what he learned, and this really confirmed the fear of a lot of slaveholders. And this is why they were so against teaching their slaves and letting the slaves learn. Because they saw what happened when Nat Turner learned. They saw that he became powerful and that he stood up for himself. And they didn't want that to happen. They said, "We want to keep making money. We want you to keep working. We don't want to educate you because things could change. We could lose money and power, and we don't even want to worry about that. So we're not going to give them education.
Correct. All right, we got about a minute left. You guys got any questions? Go ahead and drop that in the box. We got about a minute left. Grubhub got halted earlier.
Good questions today. Y'all are on top of the game. Keep it up. Any last questions?
Once again, you guys know, hit me in the DMs. I got you guys work. You guys work pretty hard. Make sure you finish that strong, finish that last packet, and we will talk to you guys later. Peace.